I want to start with a brief presentation on a quick introduction of FutureWater and the session that we are going to provide, Johannes and I, on how we implement water productivity in our methods, what kind of solutions that we see for improving water productivity. Just a quick introduction on our company. We are 13 people together forming a research and consultancy company on water resource management. Typical work that we do leads to reports, operational services, but also scientific publications. A lot of our colleagues have been connected or are still connected to universities in the Netherlands and also in Spain. We typically work for different governments, international governments, also the Dutch water boards, for example. And a lot of work we do is in the Netherlands and Europe, but also outside of Europe in Africa and Asia. And we have 2 locations, 2 offices. Obviously this one in Wageningen and also one in Cartagena, where Johannes is director. The topics that we work on are, all related to water, of course, but also quite varied. Today we will mostly focus on the top left corner, the water for food applications, but we also do a lot of work in the more integrated river basin management that was mentioned earlier. We have some drought applications for drought monitoring and impacts of drought. Flood, water access, irrigation, and climate change are typical themes that we work on. 2 typical projects that we are currently doing. I wanted to highlight to give also a little bit a broader idea of what happens at FutureWater. One very large project that has been running for several years now is the HiAware project, that focuses on the Himalaya region and the impact of climate change on glaciers and snowpacks, and related to that the livelihoods of people downstream and water shortages or water access that may come from different melting patterns now and in the future. If you're interested to know more about this, project leader is Arthur, he's right there, and also some reports are probably lying around the office, like in this small closet. Another large project that we are doing, you may have seen the introduction video that was playing during the welcome before the presentations, is the Third Eye project in Mozambique, where we are training local people to become operators of UAVs, flying sensors, or drones, as you may like to call them, in order to support small-scale farmers in pilot areas in Mozambique. This is a Securing Water for Food project funded by USAID and Sweden and the Netherlands government. So this is typically a project that we do to monitor water productivity in a sense. The crop health is monitored. We relate that to water use in order to say something about water productivity improvements that may be achieved due to implementing this project. What we want to focus on today is more towards the improvement of water productivity rather than the monitoring. This topic was already raised by a question earlier. Our tools for assessing the potential for improving water productivity are simulation models. So if you look at remote sensing, you are by definition looking at the past and conditions today. Our approach to look forward and to try to project what will be the possible future scenarios and what can be done to improve water productivity are the application of simulation models. This is quite closely related to the SDG 6.4 that was mentioned by Job, which projects a situation that we want to achieve in 2030. And well, of course, right now we can do all kinds of useful things to improve water productivity, but there are also other processes like changes in precipitation or temperature due to climate change that may impact the degree to which these improvements are actually possible. So at FutureWater we don't really have a standard model that we use for everything. We develop our own models, but we also apply different tools that are available, mostly open source tools. So here you can see a selection of a few models that are plotted in terms of their spatial scale and physical detail. So for every project or product that is required for a certain client, we look at what model would be the most suitable to address their question. Specifically for water productivity, well, it was already mentioned, yield and evapotranspiration are the key parameters that together make up water productivity. Actually, both regarding yield and evapotranspiration, FutureWater works to see, well, what is the extent to which yield can be improved and what evapotranspiration is associated with that. If you're interested in yield, there are a lot of models related to agrohydrology that have, for example, a crop growth module and look at different phenology stages and associated effects of applying fertilizer, applying irrigation, etc., etc. If you look at evapotranspiration, we often look at the more hydrological models that we apply, often spatially distributed models that show the degree to which water is available across a river basin or across an irrigation scheme, for example. So what is especially interesting in for the theme that we are currently focusing on is the degree to which models can simulate scenario runs, especially related to effects of climate change that may impact these yield and evapotranspiration parameters, so together also water productivity, and the degree to which humans can intervene and apply certain measures that may also improve water productivity, like changing the seed varieties, increasing fertilizer application, etc., etc. So to feed these models with data, there are several options. See here actually a system of two axes where you can see locally sourced data to global public domain data, non-remote sensing to remote sensing data. And actually these are all kinds of different inputs that we typically use for models, but also for calibration or validation of models that can come from all kinds of different sources and that are useful in applying models for a specific purpose. Right now we are of course concerned especially with water productivity, and thanks to this new FAO database we have a new box to add to this graph. So we are now able to look at water productivity at the continental scale thanks to remote sensing, which is very nice also for example for our third eye project to look at how this water productivity may have been affected by it. In terms of models, today, Johannes and I are going to provide a session of about 40-45 minutes still to go concerning how we can use models to quantify water productivity right now and in the future. So Johannes will provide an interactive session on the use of aquacrop, especially on the field scale, so the individual plot. What can a farmer do to improve water productivity? And after that I will provide a brief demonstration of different applications that we have done in the past on the larger scale, like the national and the river basin scales. So I would like to give the floor to Johannes.
Hey. Yes, we thought it was nice to actually make you see how this works, this modeling, to have something dynamic included in this masterclass, and that's what I'm going to present you. We're going to do some modeling here, live. First a short introduction then. I'm going to use a model called aquacrop, and aquacrop, like other crop models, somehow conceptualizes the land, atmosphere, plant, soil continuum in a model, so type of descriptions and equations. Some models are very detailed and very complex, others are more simple. Well, AgroCrop is some kind of compromise in that. And it's developed by scientists attached to FAO. A lot of details are included in the FAO 66 publication, not the 56 but the 66. And it's, you can say, a balance between simplicity and accuracy somehow. That was at least the goal. It has not such a high number of explicit parameters, so you can, even if you don't have too many details on your crop or in your plot, you can even do some simulations. And many herbaceous crops are already included and have been calibrated based on experiments all around the world. And it has a nice user interface actually designed for practitioners. Typical applications, effect of climate change on crop production, on food security and so on. Later we'll present some studies. Understand crop responses to other environmental changes in not related to climate. Yield gap analysis and optimize water productivity, water use efficiency. We did a training a few months ago for practitioners, for experts of different ministries in Armenia. And we actually, for different places in Armenia, for different crops, we simulated crop yield variability over the last 20 years, but also for a future climate. So as an example of how we use this model also. Very shortly on underlying concept, well, as you know, solar radiation is the driving force of the photosynthesis process, so driving crop production. And typically in crop yield models, a relationship is used between yields and crop evapotranspiration using some kind of factor in between the equation which is up there, which is summarized in this FAO paper 33, famous one. But AgroCrop does it a little bit differently. It looks at biomass instead of yields, and then goes from biomass to yields using a harvest index, this HI index, and it looks at canopy transpiration. So not evapotranspiration, which is the sum of soil evaporation and crop transpiration. It looks mainly at crop transpiration, and it then uses a relationship between biomass and canopy transpiration, and which is over there, and which is somehow normalized also per climate. I'm not going into more details, but basically it uses a very simple relationship, and is one of the strengths of this model, between the crop transpiration is T and the biomass. And that makes it fit for simulating on daily time steps instead of for long-term sums, which is...
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Or is it not the time now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Please.
Just
it should be a little bit loose, so I'm going to ask you more questions as well. So.
Just from my understanding, where does soil type and soil condition come in?
Yes, that's exactly the same slide.
Oh, okay.
So there are 4 components. This is the 4th one, management. And soil indeed is a very important component. And for each of these components, you're now going to see the interface. There are data and needed and so on, and you have to put that in. Just one slide of one of these 4 components that I just showed, which is the crop one, because I want to highlight here the importance of this canopy cover variable in the model. The canopy cover drives a lot of the processes which are simulated in the model, related to what happens with the leaf, expansion, all the phenological stages, and it finally drives how many water is evaporated from the soil and how many water is transpirated by the crop. And then using this water productivity parameter, it goes to biomass. CO2 concentration is also of importance, and it can also be taken into account. As you know, CO2 plants like CO2, the more CO2, the better they grow in principle. And that's also somehow included.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah?
The harvest indicator.
Harvest index, yeah?
Yeah, the index. What kind of parameters are in there? Is that something like related to the weather, extreme weather events?
Yeah.
Or human interactions? Or, but at the end, the yield is important for
Exactly.
resilience, I think.
That's the yield is actually it's the parameter what the farmer is actually interested in, right? Not so much biomass, which can be measured by remote sensing, but yield cannot be measured by remote sensing. So you have to go to yield somehow. Harvest index is crop specific, obviously. For wheat, you have a harvest index of 90%. So 90% of the biomass that you produce is harvested. But for other crops, it's very different. So this is crop specific, but also depending on all type of stresses. And that's indeed included here. Temperature stress, water stress, etc. Nice thing about using canopy cover instead of a crop coefficient of the FAO 56 or a leaf area index is that you can very easily measure it. You can measure it using drones, as we do sometimes, but also just using imagery by the farmer itself. So it's a nice, it's a good input variable for, and this is the way how it is simulated somehow in the model. You will see that right now in the interface. So now let's start with the dynamic part. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a model for. I'll take you to Tunis with a Mediterranean climate and 400 millimeters of annual rainfall, and we're going to simulate wheat, winter wheat. For one single average year. So we're not going to do multiple years or whatever because that would take too much time, but just for 1 year. And I'm going to simulate first the baseline for that particular year. Then I'm going to run a few scenarios, management scenarios. So I'm going to apply optimal fertilizers and optimal irrigation dose, etc. And I'm going to ask you as experts, how do you think that water productivity is affected by these measures? And then later, the model will tell us what the reality is, okay? Or maybe you as experts are more we'll have to, so now I'm going to start. This is kind of an experiment, of course, doing this all live, and I'm going to start AgroCrop. Can we fill this empty space in somehow, guys? Pizza's not yet here. At what time are we going to have it? It's at the end, the dinner?
The dinner's at the end, yeah. Otherwise everybody will fall asleep during your dynamic part.
Okay, I'm going to have to take it to the other.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do it differently. Do this duplicated. That makes it, I think, a bit more easier for me. Oops. Okay, so here we have the interface. And as you can see, you see here this, well, you cannot really see it a little bit, the four main components of the crop model: climate, crop management, and soil. And all these components require, they have some parameters related to that, and they require, the modeler should have some information on that, right? So I prepared, of course, all this, and I have a project file that already includes all this data, and now I'm going to run the baseline. You're gonna see how that works out. Let me first run this by portions of 10 days, and then you can actually see how the crop starts to grow and how the water in the soil starts to evolve. So what we see here below is the water in the soil, and you see different stress levels. Maybe you see a bit of different colors, which are indications for stress. You see here the canopy cover. I think it's a relative index, and here you see transpiration. And we are now 20 days ahead. The crop was sown on the 15th of October, and now we're somewhere in November. Okay, so we can continue, and as you can see, it keeps on growing. Time goes very fast. The yield is still 0. You see over there the yield, you can more or less see it. Dry yield, 0. Why? Because the flowering hasn't happened yet, so there cannot be any yield. And I think now we're starting in the flowering period. This is the flowering period. And the yield starts going up, as you can see. It's now 3.49. And then the senescence starts of the crop, and crop is harvested with a final yield of, you cannot read it, I'm afraid, 6.8 tons per hectare. That's the baseline. So my idea is now to include this in this Excel. I'm going to put it here, 6.8. And what is nice also that is in this interface you can have all type of interesting variables. You have, you cannot really read it, but this is evaporation, which tells you that there's 60 millimeters of water evaporated from the soil, 170 millimeters of water transpired by the crop. So can you read this? Yeah. So if we put that into this Excel, it will calculate us the water productivity, 173. And as you can see over there is the water productivity, 2.89 kilograms per cubic meter. That's what the model tells us. Okay, so let me just take some water. And now we're going to do some scenario analysis. And that's where you come in. And what scenarios I was planning to do? Well, 3 scenarios for the current climate. Later we go to the future climate. We just did the baseline with near optimal soil fertility, so relatively reasonably well soil fertility conditions. No irrigation at all, and the soil fully wetted at the start of the season. So different assumptions I did for this particular site. And now for scenario 1, we're going to assume that the farmer provides a lot of manure to the fields, organic manure or whatever, or maybe artificial fertilizers. In any case, in such a way that there is no fertility stress, that the soil is in optimal fertile conditions. Scenario 2, we assume that the farmer has enough water as he wants, and he can provide irrigation to his plot. And scenario 3 is a combination of the previous ones. Okay. So, questions? No. Okay. So we're gonna run that. We're gonna start that model, and then I'm going to ask you what will happen. In the meantime, you can already start thinking about that. Run, and before I click on the run button, I would like to have your opinion on whether you expect. There are 5 classes here. a highly negative impact of applying fertilizers, a moderate negative impact, so between 5 and 15% of change, negative change, little or no impact, moderate positive impact, between 5 and 50% of change, or a highly positive impact.
Assuming you go over the baseline, right? So you have your
Assuming
baseline
over
and
the
then...
baseline. Yeah, exactly. So please raise your hands who think that it's highly negative to apply fertilizers. For water productivity, I'm not talking about yield, I'm talking about water productivity. So water productivity is yield divided by evapotranspiration, or by transpiration. Nobody negative? Moderately negative? Anybody? 1?
Yeah.
2? 3?
No. I would have arguments for slightly negative, but I don't think so.
Okay, 2. And little impact, or no, little or no impact? 1?
Let's say 2.
2, okay. Moderately positive? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay.
There are no consequences if you
No pizza.
Well, I think,
no pizza.
and highly positive. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So the average of what you think is that it's going to be about 8% of increase. That's the weighted averages, okay? It's not a normal. And now we're going to see what happens. The model runs very fast for just 1 year, so dry yield is 8, and so yield is going up quite high. And now let's see how much water is evapotranspirated. 59, a little bit less evaporation, and 186, a little bit more transpiration. And you can see indeed an increase of 13% of water productivity. So you did quite a good job, I think. Now we're going to the next one. We're gonna prepare, and we're gonna assume that the model has enough, the farmer has enough water for irrigation. What would happen in this case? Negative impact, highly negative, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, moderately negative. How many guys?
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
9. Little or no impact? Also 11. Oh, 9. Oh yeah, little no. Moderately positive? Nobody?
What kind of irrigation?
Sprinkler. Sprinkler irrigation. In that case, yeah, people wanted to change, right? Yeah. Highly positive?
Yeah.
Again, what? Yeah? So your weighted average is minus 6%.
Yeah. And we have 5 people more than during the previous question.
Oh. Actually, I was thinking of having this mobile application for all this kind of things, but then I think, I don't know, this will take too much time to build efficiently. Let us just go directly to the result because it's out of time. So the ET water productivity is actually given by the interface. It's here 2.79. So this is indeed slightly negative. You again did a very good job, I have to say. Minus 4%, and you thought it was minus 6%. So now the combination of both.
That was a production, was the yield?
The yield was, I think, not so much affected because it's 7.2. Yeah, slightly higher. And now we're going to the combination. And then after we'll start with the climate change part. The combination of both. Slightly highly negative. Nobody. Moderately negative. Little or no impact. 1. Moderately positive. 1 to 2. Gijs?
Yeah. 13.
13. And highly positive. So quite some people. You're an optimist, yeah? You're always on the highly positive side. So this is 12%. Now let's see what happens. And it gives us indeed a higher yield. It's 8.3. You cannot read it, it's a pity. And the prediction, the ET water productivity, it's 3.17. So that's indeed an increase, but slightly less than the other one. You see, it's 10. But still, you were pretty close. Quite good. Okay.
Johannes, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How does the model decide when to apply irrigation? Is it always the day that stress occurs, or is there?
No, there is a threshold indeed. You can actually tell the model with a certain amount of water, readily available water, to apply for irrigation. I think for this it was with 30% of readily available water that it applies on optimal to field capacity.
Was there a sort of assumption that the area was already water stressed?
Sorry?
Was there a sort of assumption that it was stressed or not stressed?
Indeed, for the current climate, it was not so water stressed. You could have maybe seen that a bit in the baseline run that I did the first run, but there's not so much water stress in this. Now, for the future climate, we will see that there is quite some water stress, and then we're going to do the same scenarios. So this future climate I will just run. I think everybody expects a slightly lower yield, or also somebody expects a higher yield. It's of course on debate. Huh?
What's the condition? Oh, climate.
Climate change. So okay, sorry, climate change. I looked for a publication on that, and I found that for this region, -2 degrees is more or less the average of projection, and -15% rainfall.
+2 degrees.
+2 degrees, sorry.
And
Yeah.
CO2 increase, is that?
Yeah, that's indeed an issue. Indeed, the CO2 fertilization effect. As I said before, you all know that plants like CO2, so the more CO2, the higher the production. The farmers here in the greenhouses, they even add CO2 to their greenhouses. But for large field crops, this is still very much under debate, whether this effect is really going to be relevant for the future. So in previous studies that we have done, we often have provided results including this CO2 fertilization impact, and in the second section of the report providing results without the CO2 fertilization impact, because or maybe even we did not even include the CO2 fertilization because it's really under debate, particularly for open field crops. So for this simulation we did not include it, and as you can see, the crop yield is slightly lower at 6.1. So let's put that here, 6.1. And if it's maybe interesting to have a look shortly at what happens with the evapotranspiration. It's 73 and 100. So the soil evaporation is quite higher. Because the climatic demand in the future is higher, so you expect even with lower rainfall rates that soil evaporation is higher, and crop transpiration is lower. So ET, the water productivity is 2.69, which is a bit lower than in the current climate. Okay.
Johan, just a very brief question.
Yeah.
The reduced rainfall. Did you also incorporate any distribution? I mean that it's probably going to be less even.
For this simulation, we just multiplied the daily rainfall amounts by minus 50%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's actually quite a severe productivity.
So we found it also important to show this here, because when we talk about the SDG in 2030, and we want to aim for a certain increase in the future, we have to be sure what is the baseline for 2030, right? Because if we assume that the baseline is 2.89, then we might be mistaken. Maybe the baseline that is this one, the 2.69. We have to take into account what is the water productivity in the future under the future climate, not of today. Now let's run the same models for the future climate, the same scenarios, very quickly. And now I want to have your opinion on what will happen in the future climate. For a highly negative, anybody? For a moderately negative? This is for the fertilization, for optimal fertilizer application. No impact. 1, 2, 3, 4. Moderate impact.
Sorry, compared to the business as usual or compared to the original?
Sorry, a good question. Sorry, yeah, I didn't specify that. This is compared to this one, to the climate change. Okay, so now I assume that the baseline. Thanks for commenting it. I assume that the baseline is the climate change value. Okay, compared to this one. Moderately positive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 14 again, I think, more or less. And then highly positive. Yep.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. So 10% more or less. Let's see what happens. Start 2.72. So indeed a slight increase, but I think it's moderate. It's 1%. It's 1%. Why? Because there's quite some water stress in the future. As you can actually see it in the interface. This is a relative indicator of the water stress that affects canopy expansion, and it says here 51%. So water stress is dominating in the future, not so much fertility stress. Okay, let's go to the irrigation scenario then. I expect, of course, a higher yield then, but would water productivity also increase? That's the question. For a highly negative, anybody? Nobody? Moderately negative? And then little or no impact. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Moderately positive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. Highly positive.
Yes, of course. Yes, irrigation.
Of course. 3. So about a 7% increase. So now let's run. And we are having 2.72. So very, very disappointing. You're interested in what happens with the yield. Well, that's indeed quite higher. So the farmer is happy. So it goes from 6 to 7, which is an increase of 15% or something. That's quite a good increase. But the crop is somehow, probably it's also related to soil evaporation. The efficiency or water productivity is not so much affected. We would have to dive more into the model to see what happens exactly, how this happens. Now the last scenario, and that's the combination of both, and now I request your opinion. Highly negative. So optimal fertilizer and optimal irrigation. Highly negative. Nobody. Moderately negative. No impact. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Moderately positive. So 10. And highly positive? 3. Okay, let's see. And indeed, the yield is really, really high. Let's compare that first. It's 8.1. So the yield is higher than any other scenario. It's higher than today in the current climate. And it's also higher, I think, in the scenario 3, but we didn't put it here. And now the world water productivity is 3.13. So 16% increase. So at the end, they were right, no?
Actually, if you integrate that less optimal distribution of rainfall than the 10 of us.
So the point, one of the take-home messages is here, is also that it's not about one measure, but it's about the joint effect of different measures, right? And simulation, hi, welcome. Hello. Simulation models can be a useful tool to understand the impact of the combination of different measures and different future interventions. So then, just a few slides before I give the floor again to Gijs. You can think about many other adaptation scenarios like enhanced crop varieties, improvements in crop scheduling, all types of soil and water conservation measures related to terracing, mulching, etc. Deficit irrigation practices, which are crop-dependent irrigation practices, and many more. And of course, we did now simulation for 1 year, for one particular site, etc. But you want to do that for multiple years to really understand the temporal distribution and the interannual variability, better said, in yield. This is an example of an output that we did in Armenia last year. We want to do that for a combination of soils, for multiple crops, for different regions, different practices, and of course multiple climate projections. Gijs? Yes. Go ahead. Which one is this one, right? Yeah.
Yes, I will provide a brief closing presentation on this FutureWater session by giving some examples of applications that we did in the past regarding more larger scale applications of water productivity assessments and options for improvement. Typical questions that we get from especially policymakers. One example is, what are the potential impacts of climate change on agricultural systems at a national and regional level? This was a question that we got from national governments, but also from the World Bank in regions in Central Asia and the Caucasus, for example. The Mekong River Commission came to us for finding out what are the effects of climate change on crop production, but also food demand and food supply in the future. And a third example is the question that we got from the Nature Conservancy, a large American NGO, on a water fund in Upper Tana in Kenya, who are implementing this water fund, but they are interested to see what kind of measures should we implement to maximize downstream benefits, but also the benefits and economic water productivity of upstream farmers. So each of these questions we attempted to answer in different projects over the past few years. I'm going to show a few slides on our methods and results in applying the principles that Johannes demonstrated in these projects. One example was in the lower Mekong basin, where we also applied aquacrop in a very similar manner as Johannes demonstrated, but now more spatially distributed. So rather than looking at one site, we looked at different regions, which are defined by their agroecological and also hydrological characteristics. In this case, we defined 15 sub-areas, which all have different crops, and we looked at different time frames. So for each of these combinations of future scenarios, different crops, different areas, we looked at what the model projects in terms of crop production in the future. And of course, we have to deal with several trends that are currently already ongoing in this case. Here you see the crop yield for the past 30 years in the 4 countries that are involved. So you can already see a rising trend that is going on, but also a very high population growth, especially in Thailand and Vietnam, not so much in the other 2 countries. Import and export of food was also something that we included in this study. And of course, climate change. So here you see projected changes in temperature. Here's the year 2000 over the next 100 years in this region under different climate scenarios. So all these factors were taken into account in this project. An example of an output of this project is this table. Here you see for rice, for the different regions, which are on the vertical axis here, under different climate scenarios and periods, we see the impacts of the impacts on crop yield. And of course, this is crop specific. If you look at different crops, you even see some positive impacts, where rice is always either not affected or slightly or even highly negative. In the far future, this is the period 2090-2099 for the most extreme climate scenario. You can see that, if, for example, for sugarcane, there's actually a positive impact for some specific regions, especially here, and for some specific scenarios. So this is a way to combine all these different influential factors that Johannes previously mentioned. For this specific project, we also went a bit further, like I already said. It was not just crop yield modeling with aquacrop, but also looking more in depth into a country's food balance. For that, we used the food balance sheet approach, which was initiated by the FAO, which are also supplying these on the national scale. So here for Cambodia, you see an example of a food balance sheet, which kind of accounts for the different production and consumption sides of the food chain. So here you see these columns deal with production, import, and the food stock that was left from the year before. But there's food being used for export, feed and sowing, and of course consumptive use of food. And ultimately, then you can also calculate parameters related to food security, so daily calorie intake or average protein intake of the population, if you take into account the amount of people living in this country. So where these are already available on the national scale for reference years, we implemented this approach for future scenarios under climate change. So here you see an example of an output of such a table. So you have again these 15 regions with a baseline energy intake in calories per capita, per person per day under the baseline. And if you don't change anything under future scenarios, you can see what will happen, where the H stands for the furthest horizon that we included. So again, the 2090-2099 period, where you can see that this energy intake is diminished with over 25% for some of these regions. And we made similar tables also for this protein intake and fat intake.
You don't take the import into account.
The import is included in this. Johannes, I'm not sure if we projected also this trend that's currently ongoing, or we maintain the current.
Relatively simple assumption, of course. We also projected, we did some extension of the imports and exports.
So this you
related to GDP and.
So you could see this as also a business as usual scenario, where you don't really substantially change your current practices. But of course, we also, to answer this question of the Lower Mekong River Basin Commission, we also simulated different interventions. So we discussed with them what would be possible, what would be plausible in terms of mitigation, and what happens if you increase agricultural area with a few percent in these areas. Then you can see that this energy intake under the most moderate or the most light climate change condition is increased significantly, but also under the most extreme climate change scenario, there's still a rather large increase here in these regions. So this is an indication of what you could achieve with increasing agricultural area. Of course, there are all kinds of other restrictions and things you have to take into account for that. That's about the crop yield side, but well, as we already noticed in the previous session, it's of course quite closely related to the water component. So we saw how you can assess this crop yield using something like aquacrop or different crop models. But what about water supply? The question already came in this session of the water productivity database. You calculate water productivity, but is this water really available in the catchment? This is an example from a study we did in the Caucasus for different irrigation zones in Armenia in this case, where you can calculate how much additional water demand is requested or required by the crops. But all these millions of cubic meters should come from somewhere. To assess these type of questions, we often at FutureWater couple these crop models to hydrological models. So here you see the setup that we used in the Caucasus project, where you have GCMs, climate models, that are used to feed this crop model, but also to look at hydrological conditions, to predict changes in rainfall and thus also in runoff patterns, and then run a water allocation model, in this case the WEEP model, that is used to optimize the water distribution for the different uses and well, to look at this demand and supply component in more detail. In this specific project, we had also a partner with more economic expertise who used this information together with economic parameters to see what kind of adaptation measures are really feasible to achieve. This is an example also for the Caucasus where you have where you see the annual runoff affected by different climate change scenarios. So this type of information is then combined with the aquacrop results from these specific zones. Another example of this principle is something that we did in different countries, including Albania, where these results were obtained, where we looked at what happens if you maintain current irrigation applications under climate change conditions, what happens with the crop yield, so what kind of water productivity increase or decrease is achieved when you don't change anything in your irrigation practices. Per crop, of course, again, these impacts are quite different, but also per region. In Albania, we looked at 4 different agroecological regions, and you can see that for grapes, the impact is the most negative. Of course, you can also look at the other way around. In this case, in this table, we looked at what happens if you assume current yields, how much water is needed to achieve this same amount of crop yield. So in this case for tomatoes, in a certain region, a very high loss of water productivity, so to say, is found. By the way, these values are percentages per 10 years. So if you look towards 2030, you have still, in this case 2040, but if you look to 2030 with regards to the SDG, you still have some decades to go where you lose these percentages.
This is because of climate change.
Yeah, this is only because of the change in atmospheric demand for water uptake, but also changes in temperature, changes in precipitation. So this does not yet regard any interventions by humans, because that's what this next slide is about. Of course, we are interested during the session of Masterclasses to find out how can we really improve this water productivity. We see all these climate change effects, but yeah, if you go to a certain farm, there's not much you can do about that, but you can do these kind of measures. Johannes already mentioned a few of them. So of course we can also use these simulation models to look at the impact of human interventions in the system. So this is an example again from Albania, where we first established this climate change impact and then looked at what can we do to improve water productivity. We simulated different scenarios, but in this case increased fertilizer use and enhancing varieties of this crop, in this case olives, are displayed on this slide. So you can see here, if you do nothing, the business as usual scenario would be this. So you lose in every region some crop yield, but especially by increasing fertilizer use in this area and especially in this region, you can really increase this yield, also under climate change conditions. So we did these type of analysis by combining different zones, different crops, different scenarios, and you get really a big amount of information, of course. But yeah, it's a nice way to integrate all this these insights, because for every crop and for every region, it might be relevant to make this distinction, because as you can see, the impacts are not all comparable. Finally, some take-home messages from our joint session. The water productivity database that was discussed earlier is an enormous resource with a lot of information that's quite useful also to us in our work at FutureWater. And for planning interventions to improve this water productivity, we are convinced that water simulation models are very useful to examine the impact of different future scenarios, both those you have direct influence on, but also the more climate-related aspects. As we demonstrated, these can be applied on different spatial scales, but also on temporal scales. That was not so much the focus of today, but also if you look at short-term forecast, daily forecast, these type of tools can be used in irrigation planning, for example. So based on the outcomes of these agrohydrological models, policymakers can improve their decisions towards the goal of improving water productivity. That's the final slide.